This is an emergency, and I will look at it that way.
President Biden taking new steps today to address the climate crisis, turning to his executive authority after Congress stymied his far more ambitious plans to try to combat global warming.
And I'll say it again loud and clear. As president, I'll use my executive powers to combat the climate crisis in the absence of congressional action.
Standing beneath the blistering sun, the president stopped short of declaring a national climate emergency, for now at least, as he visited a Massachusetts plant that helps connect offshore wind farms to the power grid. The plant stands outside the town of Somerset, once the largest coal-powered electricity plant in the Northeast, but now makes power cables essential to capturing the wind energy.
I've been saying this for 3 years. I think jobs. Climate change, I think jobs.
The president voiced his frustration at Congress without specifically mentioning Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who effectively torpedoed broader legislation, part of the Build Back Better economic agenda, citing concerns of rising inflation. The White House says today's executive actions would create a wind energy area in the Gulf of Mexico, covering 700,000 acres with potential to power more than 3 million homes, and target $2.3 billion in funding for communities most affected by the scorching heat, including providing cooling centers and air conditioning to low-income Americans. These modest steps are the first of many, officials said, as Biden seeks to take the reins of the climate crisis in hopes of showing the world the U.S. is still serious about meeting its goals.
Let me be clear. Climate change is an emergency. And in the coming weeks, I'm going to use the power I have as president to turn these words into formal, official government actions through the appropriate proclamations, executive orders, and regulatory power that a president possesses.
So the president there just walking right up to the edge of that national climate emergency. You may ask, what is the difference? Is it simply semantics or is it more? It actually is more. Declaring a formal emergency would open the door to more funding and essentially clear away some of the bureaucratic red tape and allow the White House to do much more addressing climate. Jake, it would also send a signal to the rest of the world that the U.S. is still focused on climate change. There are questions, of course, after the lack of action in Congress. So clearly the White House saying this is the first step of many. The question is, will anything in Congress ever move? We're now 3.5 months before the midterm elections.
Jeff Zeleny in Somerset, Massachusetts. Thanks. Let's bring in CNN senior political commentator and former Obama senior advisor, David Axelrod. So, David, these executive actions fall short of the legislative package that Senate Democrats were hoping to get passed. Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon tweeted this: inaction isn't an option. Climate chaos is an emergency, and the president should declare a national climate emergency and pursue bold climate action. Now, I feel like I've seen this movie before. We're told the president's going to do something, and it might even be super bold step A, and then he doesn't do super bold step A, and he ends up looking cautious. And I just sit here thinking, why is this White House does seem kind of cautious?
Well, I think it reflects him. I mean, he is a institutionalist, and he doesn't move, precipitously. That is his nature. I think they do create a problem for themselves, though. The expectations game has been one that has tripped them up throughout, including from the beginning. This notion that with a 50-50 Senate and a closely divided House, that you were going to be able to do things of Rooseveltian magnitude, I think was problematic, because the fact is he's gotten a lot of things done. The Obama administration would have loved to have had that gun bill that he signed, would have loved to have had the infrastructure bill that he signed. If he gets the prescription drug negotiation power for Medicare, that was something Democrats have been talking about for 20 years. But everything seems smaller because the expectations were set perhaps unrealistically high. And the same is true on some of these executive actions. But I don't know what his reasoning is behind not declaring an emergency now. And I would only say, if he's going to do it, get there quickly. Don't dither. Do it.
I mean, but it's like the entire world is on fire right now. It seems like this would be actually, if you actually think it is a climate emergency, and his language suggests that he does think that, why wouldn't he? I mean, Jeff.
Because I'm sure that there are policy discussions within the White House about what the ramifications of each step would be. But again, don't get pushed there. if you're going to go there and make that announcement quickly.
So President Biden's job approval rating is at 38%, according to CNN's recent poll, with the midterm elections approaching. That's pretty low.
Yes.
That's pretty low.
Yes.
One thing that's very interesting is that Biden has these horrible approval ratings, and yet the generic ballot, would you rather vote for a Democrat or Republican in the midterm elections coming up, is pretty divided.
Yes.
And in fact, Democrats were behind in May.
Democrats made some progress.
And now it's even. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really it's sort of unprecedented. There's always been a close link between the president's approval rating and the performance of the party in midterm elections. What I make of it is that this decision, the Dobbs decision of the court,
overturning Roe v. Wade.
Overturning Roe v. Wade, the mass shootings that we saw, the election denialism, the victories in primaries such as the one in Maryland yesterday of people who have rather extreme positions on the Republican side on these, have all created some doubt among independent voters in particular about the Republican Party. 6 months ago, Jake, independent voters were saying, gee, the Democratic Party is tacking too far left. I think they're out of touch, and so on. And now I think that discussion is touching the Republicans because of all of this. And that is the hope. The hope for Democrats, with all of these atmospherics working against them, inflation, supply chains, everything working against them, the hope for Democrats is Republicans and Trump and the notion that the Republican Party has become too extreme.
So former Jeb Bush advisor Tim Miller, he has been recommending for about a year, he's very anti-Trump, the Democrats should be using wedge issues against Republicans the way that Republicans generally effectively do when they control the House and Senate against Democrats. An example came yesterday, Miller said, when Democrats acted in the House to codify, make the law of the land, the same-sex marriage legalization, which Ted Cruz and others have said they think that Supreme Court decision should be overturned as well. 47 Republicans in the House voted for it, which is a lot of Republicans, even though obviously more voted against it. 157 Republicans voted against it. Now the U.S. Senate, they're trying to see if there are enough Senate Republicans to vote for it. Do you think that's an effective strategy?
Well, I do. I mean, I think, again, for Democrats, painting the portrait of a Republican Party that has gone way off to the right, and that is so consumed by those issues that they're not really focused on inflation and the day-to-day issues that touching people's lives. I think that's the best argument that Democrats have going into the fall. I think they should campaign on some of the accomplishments that have been belittled that are really quite important of Biden's, but it's really about making this a choice, and that's the choice that they have to paint. So yes, I do agree with that. The interesting strategic question for Schumer is, if you put it on the floor, does it give some Republicans a chance to get well? Does it, you remember Mitch McConnell joined Republicans to vote for the compromise gun bill. My view was he did that because he understood the party was tacking too far to the right. Suburban voters were beginning to drift. He wanted to signify that there was a moderate or a more moderate group within the Republican Party, and that is the case here. But on the merits, I hope they do vote on it.
There was a New York Times poll, I believe it was last week, showing that most Republicans did not want Trump to run. Most Democrats don't want President Biden to run for re-election. And the number one concern was his age. I think he's 79 right now.
Yeah, he'll be 80 in December.
And he is the oldest president in the history of the United States. What do you make of that?
Listen, I do think that that is a concern. And I think it'd be foolish not to say it's not if he ran again. He'd be 82 when he got elected. He'd be closer to 90 than 80 at the end of that at the end of that term. I think that he has a body of accomplishment that is pretty significant, starting with the fact that he defeated Donald Trump at a very fraught time in our history, but the other things that I mentioned. But this isn't like other presidents. Other presidents Barack Obama was at 38 in the summer of 2011, but he also was 30 years younger. And that does make a difference, and people will consider that, and that is something that he has to evaluate as he decides whether he's actually going to go forward and run again.
But it does sound like you're suggesting, I mean, I'm putting words in your mouth, but it does sound like you're suggesting, hey, President Biden, having a successful one term with these accomplishments and getting Donald Trump out of the White House, is a nice legacy.
It is a nice legacy. And look, I'm not going to tell, no one should tell him what to do. And honestly, Jake, if he decides to run, he'll be the Democratic nominee. The idea that there'll be a successful primary challenge or even a serious one, I think, is fantasy. But the question is whether it's wise and whether that's what he feels is best for the country, for him. He may feel he's the only guy who can beat Donald Trump. I'm not sure that Donald Trump's on an upward skiing here. So, that is a decision Joe Biden's going to have to make.